The winter that exposed the cell beneath the hearth was not remembered for its cold. Northern France had endured harsher seasons, years when rivers hardened and grain failed outright. This winter passed into record for a smaller disruption, one that began with sound beneath the great hall of House Valcroy, a dull, irregular settling that no mason could quite place. The keep had stood for generations, its stones pressed together by time and inheritance, its heart the center of feasts, judgments, and marriages. When the masonry sagged, it did so without drama. A hairline crack, a slow shedding of grit. Repairs were ordered as they always were, and the household carried on above it. Unaware that the hall had begun to rest over geometry it had never been meant to cover. The breach came on the third day of work, when a single stone gave way beneath the hearth slab and opened into air that did not move. Not a void, not a crawl space, but a sealed chamber whose existence contradicted the keep's own plans. The opening was small, deliberate, shaped to be closed without leaving a scar. The masons expected rubble. What they found instead was stone smoothed to a finish that resisted soot and tool alike, a space cut with care yet deprived of the features that would explain its purpose. There was no door, no stair, no hook or drain. The chamber was too small to confine a body, too finished to be waste. It had been made to contain, not to hold. The cold announced itself immediately. It did not pour upward as a draft. It adhered to the hearthstone like a stain. Fire would burn without warming the slab. Ash clung longer than it should have. Servants crossing the hall slowed without knowing why, then began to skirt the hearth entirely. Animals refused the space outright. Hounds halted at the threshold and would not be coaxed forward. Horses shied in the courtyard below the hall, as if the weight of the stone carried something down through the floors. These reactions were noted, then dismissed, as such things often are. A house learns to quiet itself when quiet is expected. The clergy were summoned late and without urgency. The parish priest arrived with a thurible and a list of familiar explanations, offering blessings meant for damp stone and unsettled labor. He found nothing amiss and said so. The hall was reconsecrated. The hearth was relayed. The crack was closed. It should have ended there. Instead, a ledger surfaced from the steward's chest, its pages warped by smoke and thumb-thin at the edges. It was a practical book, kept for provisioning and wages, written in the same hand for years. Among the entries for grain and tallow were recurring notations that did not fit the household's visible needs. Food, oil, salt, small quantities, regular intervals, always listed under the same phrase, struck through and rewritten as if the steward had learned to be careful with his own language. A room with no door. When asked, the steward did not deny the entries. He said only that the house had its customs, and that these deliveries were not for mouths that could be counted. His composure did not survive the question. He was reassigned within the week, sent to manage outlying lands where the stone beneath him would not listen. The ledger was removed from the hall and placed with other papers that required no further attention. Repairs continued. Witnesses were dispersed. Silence did what it always does when ordered to work. The escalation came with a visitor who refused to accept silence as an answer. A canon from a neighboring chapter, learned and insistent, arrived with letters of introduction and a reputation for method. He requested access to the hearth and the space beneath it, citing the ledger and the irregularities of the stonework. The request was denied politely, then firmly. He pressed. Access was granted under supervision. The opening widened just enough to admit light and breath. What occurred in that space was recorded only by its aftermath. The canon emerged without injury, without visible mark, and without coherence. He could not say what he had seen, only that the space had responded to his presence as if it recognized him and found him insufficient. He did not remain at Valcroy. He did not return to his chapter. His subsequent writings, preserved elsewhere, repeat a single image without elaboration. Stone that learns a measure of a voice. Authority intervened, as authority does when a matter threatens to move beyond the private. Orders were issued to seal the chamber permanently. The opening was closed with new stone, mortared and smoothed, its outline disguised beneath the hearth's familiar curve. A folio was produced from the house's archives to justify the work, smoke blackened and brittle, its margins crowded with consecration marks that were neither wholly clerical nor wholly architectural. The drawings within showed the chamber in cross-section, its proportions precise and repeated. The folio did not name what the space was for. It named only what was not to do. It was not to be enlarged. It was not to be opened without cause. It was not to be fed irregularly. The hearth returned to use. Feast resumed. Judgment was passed. Yet the cold did not leave. It settled into the stone as a condition rather than a symptom. Generations later, travelers would remark on it without knowing why, warming their hands and failing to do so. Children avoided sitting there. Ash fell into patterns that did not match the sweep of fire. The hall learned to live around a center that refused to participate. This residue, more than any testimony, persisted. The folio, returned to its chest, did not remain quiet. Its final pages referenced other works undertaken by allied houses, written in a shorthand that assumed familiarity. Similar cells maintained by allied houses. The line read, without flourish or apology. The practice was not singular. It was distributed. The stone beneath Valkroy was not an error, but a precedent. Somewhere beyond the keep, in other halls and other winters, the same geometry had been cut into the earth, refined and repeated, waiting for hands that knew how to read it. The record moves east, away from the hearth and into mountains, where stone is not merely material, but a language spoken fluently by those who know how to cut it. In the early years of the 14th century, House Eberhain's fortress clung to a Rhineland ridge with the confidence of something that expected to be there indefinitely. Its walls were steep, its approach narrow, its visibility absolute. Nothing about it suggested secrecy. That came later, not through collapse or accident, but through paperwork. The trigger was political, and therefore inevitable. A succession dispute fractured the house along familiar lines, and when it came to scrutiny of imperial clerks tasked with inventorying assets, debts, and obligations, chests were opened that had not been disturbed in decades. Account books were unfolded and refolded with professional indifference. Among them were tax records that appeared unremarkable at first glance, their columns filled with expected figures, their seals intact. It was only when one clerk noticed a stitching along the spine, too careful, too deliberate, that the anomaly began to take shape. Bound into the accounts, between pages that recorded tolls and levies, were vellum sheets of a different hand and purpose. These were not annotations. They were plans. Architectural drawings rendered with precision and restraint, stripped of ornament and scale, marked not with measurements, but with sigils repeated at exact intervals. The fortress's visible floors were accounted for, its towers and walls aligned with known surveys. Beneath them, however, the drawings indicated sublevels that did not correspond to any recorded construction, spaces without names, chambers without access points. The geometry matched the proportions recorded in the Valkroy folio, down to tolerances that should not have survived translation across regions. When questioned, the household offered no explanation because none was required. The plans were not denied. They were treated as irrelevant. Renovations were already underway on the upper works, and it was during these that the second set of disturbances occurred. Laborers reported hearing structured sound beneath their feet, not echoes or settling, but cadence, a pattern of vocalization that rose and fell with the regularity of a rite. The fortress was unoccupied at the time, its family dispersed while the dispute was adjudicated. There were no choirs below the stone. The sound persisted regardless, audible only during certain hours, ceasing when work stopped, resuming when tools struck stone again. The surrounding towns reacted first with caution, then with avoidance. Trade routes were altered subtly at first, carts taking longer paths without explanation. Inns reported fewer travelers willing to stay within sight of the fortress. Local rites adjusted their calendars, processions turning away from the mountain on days they had once climbed it. This was not panic. It was pattern recognition, the slow collective decision to give a place room. Authority took notice only when revenue followed the routes away. Imperial surveyors were dispatched to resolve the matter with maps. Their task was straightforward: measure what existed, reconcile it with the plans, close the discrepancy. They descended into the fortress with chains and chalk, marking steps and turns, calling out numbers that were recorded by hand. At a certain point, the numbers ceased to align. A man stepped forward to verify a count and did not return. There was no collapse, no sound of struggle. The chain slackened and lay still. The surveyors withdrew without debate, leaving their chalk marks to fade on stone that did not acknowledge them. The evidence was gathered quickly after that. The Vellum plans were removed from the tax books and examined in isolation. When overlaid with the Valkyrie folio, the match was exact. The cells were not identical by accident. They were iterations. Authority intervened decisively, sealing the lower works and declaring the fortress unstable. Notices were posted. Guards were stationed. The official explanation cited subsidence and risk. Unofficially, custodians were instructed not to enter the sealed areas under any circumstance. The haunting residue took time to manifest, as it often does when access is denied rather than abused. Decades later, when the fortress served as a storehouse and then as a waypoint for caretakers, reports emerged of sound without source. Not the chanting described earlier, but echoes that arrived before the footsteps that should have caused them. Voices repeating the last word spoken aloud, not as mimicry but as completion. These accounts were recorded and dismissed, then recorded again when dismissal failed to quiet them. In the final ledger associated with the site, a marginal note appears beside the entry marking the ceiling of the sublevels. It is brief, written in the same hand that stitched the plans into the accounts. Southern partners refining the practice. The phrase offers no context because it did not need to. By then, the pattern had moved on, following trade and bloodlines toward a coast where stone met salt and the cells learned to be fed. By the middle of the 15th century, the pattern reached water. Stone behaves differently near the sea, absorbing salt and sound, holding moisture in ways that confuse tools and time alike. House Montelou Citadel rose from a limestone spur overlooking a narrow Italian harbor, its walls pale and polished, its chapel bells audible far out over the surf. The family was known for its piety and its generosity, a house that fed pilgrims and endowed altars with the same confidence it extended credit. When people vanished from its service, the losses were attributed at first to the coast itself. Sailors disappear. Servants drift. The ledger absorbs these absences without comment. The destabilizing event arrived not with rumor, but with arithmetic. A Florentine banking consortium, tasked with auditing Montelou's accounts after a change in trusteeship, noted a discrepancy too regular to ignore. Provisions flowed into the citadel in quantities that exceeded the needs of its visible population by a consistent margin. Food that spoiled quickly, oil consumed in precise intervals. Salt ordered not in bulk for preservation, but in measured allotments that suggested use rather than storage. The figures repeated across years, immune to feast days and fasting seasons alike. The books balanced. The bodies did not. Inquiry produced deflection rather than denial. The family attributed the excess of hospitality to almsgiving conducted discreetly, to maritime loss. None of it held under sustained review. When pressed, the steward deferred to the chapel, where records were kept differently and access was governed by sacrament rather than contract. It was there, beneath stone worn smooth by generations of knees, that the anomaly revealed itself. A flagstone at the chapel center rang hollow when struck, its tone duller than surrounding stone. When lifted under pretense of repair, it revealed a narrow descent into a sub-basement that did not appear on any plan submitted to the consortium. The cell below was finished in the same manner recorded elsewhere. Walls smooth beyond necessity, corners eased, proportions exact. Unlike Valkyrie, there were markings here not decorative but functional, scored into the stone as if to guide movement rather than commemorate belief. They were not symbols of devotion. They were instructions. The air carried a persistent scent of spent wax. Not smoke, but the memory of flame after it has been denied oxygen. The cold present in northern halls was absent here. In its place was weight, a pressure that settled on the chest and resisted breath without obstructing it. Human reaction split along predictable lines. The townspeople whispered of fasting rooms, of places where the family withheld sustenance to bargain for favor. The family responded by hosting public feasts of increasing extravagance, tables heavy with bread and fish, wine poured until the floor ran slick. Charity was performed loudly. Silence was cultivated below. Disappearances continued, now accompanied by reassignment notices that moved names out of sight rather than off the page. Authority hesitated. caught between reverence and revenue. Escalation came through the church, not as accusation but as inventory. A monk was assigned to catalog relics and verify endowments, a task that required him to cross between chapel and archive with regularity. His marginal notes survive, written small and tight in the corners of otherwise orthodox texts. He recorded an observation without comment, that the presence below responded to lineage rather than prayer. He noted that hymns altered nothing, while names spoken in the family's private register produced measurable changes in the air. He did not speculate. He recorded and moved on. The evidence prop that bound the case was not an official report, but a personal letter sealed in black wax, never sent, discovered among the monk's effects after he failed to report back. It outlined a schedule of offerings keyed to births and deaths within the bloodline, not as sacrifice but as calibration. The quantities matched the consortium's figures precisely. The language avoided theology entirely. It spoke of maintenance, of keeping a balance that could be measured by absence rather than presence. Authority intervened late and softly. Access to the sub-basement was restricted under the guise of structural safety. The consortium withdrew its auditors. The family increased its endowments. The chapel remained open, its bells continuing to mark hours that meant different things above and below. The haunting residue was olfactory rather than acoustic. Long after the cell was sealed, the chapel retained the smell of extinguished candles, strongest at the center stone, resistant to cleaning and time. Those who knelt their rows with the impression that something had been concluded without them. The letter's final line referenced a northern stronghold where containment failed, written without emphasis, as if noting a change in weather. The practice, refined at the coast, had already been tested elsewhere. The next site would not be discovered through books or audits. It would announce itself through collapse, when stone that had been taught to hold finally chose to open. The storm that exposed Calderwick arrived without omen, a hard Atlantic system that tore across the highlands with the indifference of weather unburdened by history. Roofs failed, trees folded, rivers ran louder than memory. When the eastern wall of House Calderwick's keep gave way, it was catalogued at first as another casualty of wind and saturation, stone surrendering to time at last. The family had been gone for generations. The site left the caretakers in legend, its records thin and contradictory. What the storm revealed beneath the fallen masonry was not erosion, but preservation. The inner cell stood intact behind the collapsed wall, its face unmarred, its joints tighter than the surrounding stonework that failed around it. There was no sign of forced construction, no record of quarrying or transport that would explain its presence. Parish rolls and crown inventories listed no such addition. The anomaly was temporal rather than structural. The cell had always been there, and yet it had never been built, at least not in any way the records could admit. Its proportions matched those documented elsewhere, but the finish was finer. The tolerances narrower, as if the design had learned from earlier iterations. Local reaction was immediate and unambiguous. The site was shunned within days, paths abandoned, grazing moved upslope despite poorer forage. Witnesses reported hearing their own names spoken from within the exposed stone. Not shouted or whispered, but stated as one would confirm an entry in a book. Those who heard it did not linger to test the experience. They left offerings at the edge of the ruined wall instead, objects without value chosen for their weight. Iron nails, river stones, broken tools. The community did not ask what was inside. It behaved as if the question had already been answered. Authority responded with force rather than finesse. Crown officials arrived with orders to destroy the cell, to remove the anomaly entirely and restore the ruin to harmlessness. Tools were brought down the hill and put to work. The first strikes rang true, iron on stone. By the second hour, corrosion had set in with unnatural speed. Blades pitted, handles softened. A hammer left resting against the cell face was found the next morning reduced to red dust, its shape preserved only in the outline it left behind. The officials withdrew, not in panic, but in recognition that the task exceeded instruction. The burned folio recovered from the lock below the keep provided context where authority failed. It had been weighted and sunk deliberately, its pages fused by water and ash, its cover warped by heat. When separated and dried, the text within proved legible enough. It detailed emergency rites intended to reseal responsive enclosures, written in a hand that assumed familiarity with failure. The language was technical, devoid of prayer, concerned with sequence and timing rather than invocation. One passage warned that destruction accelerated what containment delayed, a conclusion reached through experience rather than theory. The haunting residue at Calderwick did not fade with sealing attempts because no sealing was completed. The cell remained exposed, its face weathering storms without change. Surveyors in later centuries recorded a persistent acoustic phenomenon, a sound that preceded measurement, a resonance that interfered with instruments before registering in the ear. Notes describe voices arriving a fraction of a second ahead of the steps that should have caused them, as if the space were answering a question before it was fully asked. These accounts were filed and ignored, then filed again when repetition forced acknowledgement. Patterns emerged when Calderwick was placed alongside earlier sites. The folio's margins reference Valcroy and Eberhain obliquely, not by name but by proportion and outcome. Montelus was cited for refinement, for sustaining balance without exposure. Calderwick was marked as a breach, a lesson in what occurred when maintenance lapsed and inheritance fractured. The cell there did not fail because it was flawed. It failed because it was unattended. The forward pull in the record comes not from speculation, but from consolidation. The burned folio's final pages abandon emergency measures and turn instead to design principles for a site that would not be subject to weather, politics, or abandonment. A fortress maintained without residents. Endowment structure to outlive scrutiny. Cells sealed behind false walls rather than hearths or chapels. The pattern, once distributed, was converging. The next site would not announce itself through cold stone or sound. It would endure quietly, waiting to be noticed only when its continuity could no longer be denied. The final site does not enter the record through collapse or confession. It appears through maintenance. In the early years of the 18th century, in a border region of Eastern Europe defined more by treaties than terrain, House Drassic's fortress was listed as abandoned. Its family line had thinned, then vanished from public registries, leaving behind a keep judged too costly to repurpose and too remote to matter. The abandonment was neat. Gates were closed. Inventories were filed. Guards were withdrawn. And yet the stone did not weather as abandoned stone should. Roof lines remained true. Mortar did not soften. Paths were kept clear by hands that did not sign their names. The trigger that reopened the case was modern and procedural, the kind of event that arrives without narrative intent. A restoration survey was commissioned decades later to assess the fortress as a potential heritage site. Engineers arrived with instruments calibrated for subsidence and decay. What they recorded instead was function. Behind walls flagged as decorative infill, thermal readings indicated sealed voids maintaining stable internal temperatures. The pattern repeated across multiple sections of the keep, too consistent to be explained by chance. When limited access was granted through existing service corridors, the cameras captured something the earlier sites had denied: continuity. The cells were there, intact and sealed, their proportions refined beyond earlier examples. False walls concealed them from casual inspection. Venting was integrated into the structure in ways that mimicked natural airflow. The surfaces bore the same smoothing, the same ease corners, but without the wear that suggested intervention or repair. These were not relics. They were operational. The anomaly lay not in their existence but in their upkeep. Rituals documented centuries earlier, feeding schedules, calibrations keyed to lineage markers, were shown through residue and record to persist unchanged. The absence of residence had not interrupted the work. It had perfected it. Social reaction, when it came, was retroactive. Footage was classified. The site was reclassified as unsafe, access restricted under the language of structural hazard. The restoration team was reassigned. Reports were split and archived under separate jurisdictions, each insufficient on its own to compel action. Authority did not deny what had been found. It redistributed it until the finding lost mass. The fortress returned to its status as abandoned, a designation that now functioned as camouflage. Escalation emerged not from further exploration, but from comparison. A composite archive was assembled quietly by those tasked with reconciling discrepancies that would not settle. Correspondence surfaced linking Valcroy, Eberhain, Montelus, Calderwick, and Drassic through marriages, endowments, and share contractors whose names shifted across languages but not across methods. The letters avoided theology entirely. They spoke of load, tolerance, and interval, of what happened when cells were starved too quickly, and what happened when they were overfed, of failures attributed not to malevolence but to miscalculation. The evidence prop that closed the circle was a ledger compiled after the fact, its pages collating centuries of notes into a single doctrine. It named no entities. It framed the practice as containment rather than worship, maintenance rather than bargain. The houses were not portrayed as cults, but as custodians bound by blood to a task they did not originate and could not abandon. Each site had refined a variable. Valcroy established geometry. Eberhain standardized proportion. Montelus perfected feeding, without exposure. Calderwick documented failure. Drassic integrated all of it into a structure designed to endure without witnesses. The haunting residue at Drassic is measurable and banal. One sealed cell registers heat without a source, a steady output that does not fluctuate with season or activity. Instruments record it. Instruments fail to explain it. The stone around it remains cool, as if insulating not against cold but against consequence. No sound is reported. No names are heard. The silence is complete, and therefore louder than any echo recorded elsewhere. What remains after Drassic is not a question of belief, but of obligation. The doctrine concludes with a line written in the same hand that stitched plans into textbooks and weighted folios for sinking. If maintenance ceases, acceleration follows. The fortress stands, maintained by funds that renew themselves through mechanisms now too diffuse to trace. The cells remain sealed, not because they have been forgotten, but because forgetting was engineered into the system. The record ends where it began, with stone performing a function that refuses to announce itself. The cells are not empty. They were never meant to be. The only unresolved variable is time, and time, as the doctrine notes without emphasis, is the one resource no bloodline can contain indefinitely.